Every closed door in your life is a psychological event, and the research on what actually happens to people after doors close has found something that contradicts almost everything the culture tells you about loss and starting over. The people who recover most completely from rejection, failure, and the collapse of carefully built plans are not the ones with the most resilience, the best support systems, or the most optimistic personalities. They are the ones who understand a specific mechanism in the human brain that most people never learn about. One that makes starting over not just possible but, in documented cases, better than the thing that was lost. If the door that just closed is not the final door, then the window that just opened may be larger than you think. And the science of why that is true starts with something almost no one talks about. By the end of this video, you will understand the documented neuroscience and psychology of loss and new beginnings, why human beings are systematically wrong about how badly closed doors will hurt and how long they will hurt, what the research has found about the specific cognitive mechanisms that make starting over genuinely possible at any point in life, and what the people who start over most successfully are actually doing differently. This is grounded in real science, and it applies to whatever door has just closed in your life. Let's begin with the finding that should be the foundation of every conversation about starting over, and that most people have never encountered in any form that actually changed how they feel about their own losses. In 1998, Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University and Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia published research that introduced a concept that would reshape the psychology of well-being and prediction, the psychological immune system. The term refers to a set of cognitive mechanisms that human beings possess, largely below the level of conscious awareness, that function to make the best of adverse circumstances, to find the meaning in the loss, to reframe the rejection as redirection, to construct a version of events that preserves or even enhances the sense of self in the face of outcomes that threatened it. The psychological immune system does for psychological well-being what the physical immune system does for physical health. It defends against threats, repairs damage, and restores function. And like the physical immune system, it operates largely without conscious direction. You do not choose to feel better. You simply find over time that you do. Gilbert and Wilson's research established something that has been replicated across dozens of studies in multiple countries. Human beings are systematically and significantly wrong about how long negative events will affect them. When asked to predict how unhappy a future negative event will make them, and for how long, people consistently overestimate the duration of their unhappiness, by substantial margins. The specific study that made this finding most vivid involved academic professors who were told, before a tenure decision, to predict how happy or unhappy they would be if they received or were denied tenure. The predictions were extreme. Tenure was expected to produce great happiness. Denial was expected to produce significant and lasting unhappiness. The actual outcomes, measured over time, were far more muted. Professors who received tenure were somewhat happier, but not dramatically so, and the effect faded relatively quickly. Professors who were denied tenure were somewhat unhappier, but within a year, they were reporting well-being levels that were statistically indistinguishable from those who had succeeded. The door that had seemed catastrophic was not catastrophic. The psychological immune system had done its work. Gilbert named this phenomenon effective forecasting error. Checky, specifically the consistent overestimation of the emotional impact of future negative events. And the mechanism behind the overestimation is specific. People imagine living inside the bad outcome, focused on the closed door, the rejection, the failure, without imagining the full context of the future in which that outcome would actually be experienced, including all the other things they would also be thinking about, pursuing, building, and enjoying. The closed door feels in imagination like the whole world. In reality, it becomes, over time, one element in a life that is still happening, still generating new experience, still containing relationships and meaning and possibility. But Gilbert and Wilson's research found something even more significant, something that most accounts of this research miss entirely. And it involves a specific cognitive mechanism that explains not just why closed doors hurt less than expected, but why they sometimes lead to something genuinely better. The psychological immune system does not only soften the blow of the closed door, it actively constructs a new relationship to the changed circumstances. One that, research has consistently found, often becomes genuinely preferable to the circumstances that were lost. This sounds like the kind of everything happens for a reason thinking that sophisticated people rightly question. And the research is not making a metaphysical claim about the order of the universe. It is making a specific cognitive claim about what happens inside the human mind after significant loss, and the distinction matters enormously. Research by Gilbert and Wilson on what they call synthetic happiness The happiness that is constructed by the mind rather than found in optimal circumstances found that people in irreversible situations where they have no choice but to live with the outcome consistently generate higher levels of genuine satisfaction with that outcome than people who are in reversible situations and maintain the option to change their minds. The classic experiment involved photography students who were asked to select one of two photographs they had made in a darkroom exercise. One group was told their choice was permanent, another group was told they could change their minds within several days. When happiness with the chosen photograph was assessed several days later, the permanent choice group was measurably happier with their selection than the reversible choice group, not because their photograph was objectively better, because the mind, committed to a permanent outcome, worked harder to find and construct genuine value in it. This is the rationalization engine, the cognitive process through which the human mind generates genuine appreciation for and genuine investment in the circumstances it finds itself in. And it is not a bug in the system. It is a fundamental feature of how human beings construct meaning and satisfaction from the real, imperfect circumstances of real lives. The person who loses the job and starts over in a new field often ends up within years more satisfied with their work than they were before. Not because the new field is objectively better, because the mind, committed to the new path through the specific mechanism of the rationalization engine, finds and amplifies the genuine value that was already there, value that the old path held in comparison would have made harder to see. Research by Sonia Lubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside, on what she calls positive self-evaluation found that people have a well-documented tendency to evaluate their own choices, circumstances, and attributes more positively than objective assessors would, and that this positive bias, while sometimes distorting, is significantly associated with better well-being, greater resilience, and more effective motivation for future goal pursuit. The mind wants to make the best of things. It is designed to make the best of things, and the closed door is often the event that activates this capacity most powerfully, because the permanence of the closure commits the mind to the task of finding and constructing genuine value in the world that exists on the other side of it. But there is a specific cognitive pattern that prevents this mechanism from working, a way of responding to closed doors that keeps the mind focused on what was lost, rather than activating the rationalization engine that would allow genuine engagement with what comes next. And understanding this pattern is essential before we can talk about what starting over actually requires. Research by Neil Rose at Northwestern University on counterfactual thinking, the cognitive process of imagining alternative versions of past events, if only I had done X instead of Y, has produced one of the most specific and most actionable findings in the psychology of loss and recovery. Counterfactual thinking is, in moderate amounts, adaptive. The mental simulation of alternative paths, if I had done that differently, the outcome would have been better. Generates the specific kind of information that improves future decision making. It extracts lessons from experience, it identifies what could be done differently next time, and it is one of the primary mechanisms through which human beings learn from failure. But counterfactual thinking has a specific pathological form that Rose and colleagues have documented extensively. The upward counterfactual that is sustained beyond its useful duration, focused on outcomes that cannot be changed, and directed at circumstances that are genuinely irreversible. This form of counterfactual thinking is the mental equivalent of trying to open a door that is already closed and locked. Exerting cognitive effort on a scenario that no amount of cognitive effort can change. Research by Rose and Amy Somerville at Carleton University on regret found that people who engage in extensive upward counterfactual thinking about irreversible losses show significantly longer recovery times, lower well-being, and greater functional impairment than people who disengage from counterfactual processing of irreversible events. The counterfactual thinking is not helping them learn. It is keeping them mentally inside the closed door. Research by Susan Nolan Hoeksema at Yale on rumination, which we have discussed in previous videos on this channel, found that the sustained, passive replay of negative events without movement toward resolution or action is one of the strongest predictors of depression and prolonged impairment following adverse events. The ruminative return to the closed door, the repeated mental examination of what was lost, what could have been different, what might have happened if the door had stayed open, is the specific cognitive pattern that prevents the psychological immune system from doing its work. The mechanism is important. The psychological immune system operates most effectively when the mind disengages from the irreversible alternative and engages with the actual present and future. It is activated by commitment, by the mind genuinely turning toward the new circumstances rather than continuing to face the closed door, and anything that keeps the mind focused on the closed door delays and undermines the operation of the mechanism that would make starting over genuinely possible. This does not mean that grief is wrong or that processing loss is inadvisable. Research by George Bonanno at Columbia University on bereavement and recovery found that some degree of engagement with loss, including the full emotional processing of what was lost and what it meant, is both normal and necessary. The problem is not the processing of loss. It is the prolonged, passive, resolution-resistant rumination that substitutes for genuine processing and genuine engagement with the changed circumstances. The grief is necessary, the rumination is the problem, and the distinction between them is more specific than most people realize. Here is a distinction that most people in the middle of loss have never been shown clearly, and that, once understood, changes how you relate to your own experience of a closed door. Research by Paul Watkins at the University of Exeter, building on Nolan Hochzimmer's rumination research, established a specific and measurable distinction between two forms of engagement with difficult experience: ruminative processing and reflective processing. Ruminative processing is passive, repetitive, and resolution-resistant. It is the mental pattern of returning to the same painful content, the same lost possibility, the same regretted choice, the same rejected application, again and again, without generating new understanding, new meaning, or new direction. It generates affect without insight. It feels like processing because it involves sustained attention to difficult material, but it does not move. It circles. Reflective processing is active, directed, and meaning-seeking. It returns to difficult material with a specific question. What does this experience mean? What can be understood from it? How does it fit into a larger understanding of who I am and where I am going? It moves through the material toward integration, and it generates both insight and eventually the specific form of cognitive closure that allows the mind to disengage from the irreversible alternative and genuinely engage with what comes next. Research by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas on expressive writing, one of the most replicated intervention findings in clinical psychology, established that the specific form of engagement with loss that produces both faster recovery and genuine growth is the written movement from description through emotional acknowledgement toward meaning and interpretation, not venting, which is emotionally activating without being cognitively integrating, not suppression, which reduces short-term distress while increasing long-term intrusion, but the specific movement toward meaning that transforms the loss from an open wound to a scar, still there, still part of the story, but no longer bleeding. The person who grieves well, who processes the closed door in the way the research describes as genuinely adaptive, does several things. They feel the loss fully without suppression or performance. They allow the emotional reality of what was lost to be genuinely registered. And then, and this is the specific cognitive move, they begin the work of meaning making, asking what the loss reveals, what it changes, what it makes possible that was not possible before, and what it demands of the person who must now live in the world that exists on the other side of it. This movement, from loss to meaning, is not automatic. It requires deliberate cognitive work, and it is the specific work that the practices of starting over are built on. But before we get to those practices, there is one more finding in the research on loss and recovery that changes how you understand what starting over is actually for, and it is the most counterintuitive finding in this entire conversation. Research by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina on post-traumatic growth, which we have touched on in previous videos on this channel, has established something that the culture has a very difficult time with, that a significant proportion of people who experience genuine, serious adversity report that the experience ultimately led to positive changes that they would not trade back. Not that the loss was good, not that the suffering was worth it in some simple balance sheet sense, but that the process of engaging honestly and fully with the loss produced genuine growth in specific, measurable, documented domains that would not have occurred in the absence of the adversity. The growth domains Tedeschi and Calhoun identified are specific, a clearer and more genuine sense of personal strength, deeper and more honest close relationships, new possibilities that were not visible or accessible before the loss, a more conscious and more genuine relationship with the present moment, and what they describe as existential deepening, a more honest engagement with the fundamental questions of what matters and how to live. Between 30 and 70% of people who experience significant adversity, depending on the study and the domain, report at least some of these forms of genuine growth, not as a consolation narrative, as a genuine description of what happened. The mechanism that Tedeschi and Calhoun identified for post-traumatic growth is directly relevant to everything we have been discussing. Growth is most likely when the person engages in what they call deliberate rumination, not the passive ruminative cycling that Nolan Hochzimmer's research documented as harmful, but the active, directed, meaning-seeking engagement with the loss that produces genuine cognitive and narrative reorganization. The loss in this framework is not merely an obstacle to be survived. It is a disruption of the assumptive world, Marcus's the set of assumptions about how the world works and what their place in it is, that Ronnie Jenoff-Bullman described in her work on trauma. And the disruption of the assumptive world, while genuinely painful, creates the specific condition in which genuine reconstruction is possible. The old model is broken. A new, often more accurate and more genuinely adequate model can be built. Post-traumatic growth is the research validation of the title's claim. The closed door is not the coffin door, and the evidence suggests that for a substantial proportion of people who engage honestly with what the closed door produced, the world on the other side is not merely survivable. It is, in specific documented ways, richer than the world on the other side of the door that was kept open. But this is the point in the conversation where the research requires a specific caveat, because the post-traumatic growth narrative can be misused in ways that do real damage to people who are genuinely suffering. And the research is clear about where the misuse lies. Let's be honest about the most common misuse of the insights this conversation contains, because the research on psychological resilience, post-traumatic growth, and the psychological immune system has been enthusiastically adopted by the self-help industry in ways that the researchers who produced it explicitly reject. The everything happens for a reason framework, the cultural narrative that closed doors are always redirections, that losses are always blessings in disguise, that suffering always produces growth, is not what the research shows. And applying it indiscriminately to people in genuine pain does specific and documented harm. Research by Brock Bastian at the University of Melbourne on the cultural pressure to be happy found that when people in pain are told, explicitly or implicitly, that they should be finding the positive in their experience, the effect is not encouragement, it is invalidation. The message that suffering should be producing growth or gratitude creates an additional burden on top of the original pain. The burden of feeling like you are failing at recovery because you have not yet found the lesson. Research by James Pennebaker on emotional processing found that the most damaging approach to significant loss is the premature closure of genuine grief. The social and personal pressure to move on before the genuine emotional processing has occurred. The loss that is covered over with "it was for the best" before it has been genuinely felt is not integrated. It is suppressed. And suppressed loss, as we have discussed, tends to reappear as anxiety, as unexplained sadness, as the specific quality of unfinished business that decades-old losses can still carry. The research does not say that the closed door is always a redirection. It does not say that the loss will always produce growth. It says that for a substantial proportion of people who engage honestly with their losses, who feel them fully before reframing them, who do the specific cognitive work of meaning-making rather than jumping to premature resolution, genuine growth becomes available. The sequence matters enormously. Full feeling first, meaning-making after, not meaning-making as a substitute for feeling, or as a way of avoiding the genuine pain of what was lost, but as the specific cognitive work that begins once the genuine emotional processing has created the necessary ground for it. And the research on what distinguishes the people who grow from those who remain stuck after adversity is not primarily about personality or resilience scores or prior positive thinking habits. It is about the willingness to engage honestly with the full experience, including the parts that hurt, the parts that are ambiguous, the parts that do not resolve into a clean narrative, and to remain with that honest engagement long enough for genuine meaning to emerge, rather than being rushed into premature closure. This is both harder and more genuinely hopeful than the "everything happens for a reason" shortcut. It requires more from the person, and it produces something more real. But there is a specific kind of starting over that is particularly relevant to the people watching this video, and it involves something that most discussions of resilience and new beginnings consistently underestimate. The starting over that happens not in the aftermath of catastrophe, but in the ordinary, undramatic accumulation of closed doors that most lives contain. Here is the insight that this entire video has been building toward. And it requires stepping back from the dramatic cases, the major losses, the significant failures, the serious tragedies, and looking at the specific psychological profile of the people who navigate the ordinary, accumulating experience of closed doors across a lifetime. Because most starting over is not the dramatic kind. Most starting over is the quiet, unglamorous, repeated, sometimes embarrassing kind. The thing you were building that did not work. The direction you were going that turned out to be a dead end. The version of yourself you thought you were becoming that turned out to be a partial story. The relationship that ended without drama. The plan that simply did not survive contact with reality. These ordinary closed doors accumulate across a life. And the research on how people navigate this accumulation, what separates the people who remain genuinely open to new beginnings from the people who progressively contract their sense of what is possible, is specific enough to be both challenging and usable. Research by Carol Dweck at Stanford on what she calls implicit theories of ability, the foundational work on growth versus fixed mindset, established that the most consequential variable in navigating repeated failure and closed doors is not optimism, not resilience, and not social support. It is the implicit belief about whether the qualities and capacities that the closed door was testing are fixed or developable. The person with a fixed mindset experiences a closed door as a verdict. The rejection, the failure, the outcome that went wrong is evidence about who they are, their intelligence, their talent, their worthiness, rather than evidence about what happened in a specific attempt under specific circumstances. And because the closed door is a verdict about identity, it is genuinely threatening. The mind does not want to open new doors when opening doors risks further verdicts about identity. The person with a growth mindset experiences a closed door as information. The rejection, the failure, the outcome that went wrong is evidence about what did not work in this specific attempt, what was insufficient, what was mistimed, what needs to be developed, rather than evidence about who they fundamentally are. And because the closed door is information rather than verdict, the next door can be approached with the specific knowledge that was not available at the previous one. Dweck's research found that growth mindset is not a fixed trait. It is a learnable cognitive orientation, one that can be developed through specific practices and that, once developed, produces measurably different responses to failure, measurably different levels of persistence in the face of difficulty, and measurably different trajectories over time. But there is something in the research on starting over that goes beyond mindset, something more specific and more personally confronting than a simple cognitive reframe. It is what happens to identity through the process of repeated starting over. And it is the dimension of this conversation that I think is most important, and least often addressed. Research by Dan McAdams at Northwestern University on narrative identity, the understanding that human beings construct a coherent sense of self through the stories they tell about their lives, found that the people who navigate repeated adversity, repeated starting over, repeated reinvention most successfully are the people whose life narrative contains what McAdams calls redemption sequences, episodes in which negative events led to positive outcomes, in which the closed door revealed a path that the open door would have obscured. These people are not pretending that the closed doors were painless. They are not performing gratitude for their losses. They are doing something more specific. They are incorporating their history of starting over into a narrative of a self that is genuinely capable of starting over, that has started over before, that knows from personal experience that the world on the other side of a closed door is inhabitable, that carries as part of its story the specific evidence that survival and reconstruction, and sometimes genuine growth, are available to this particular person in this particular life. This narrative self is not built by pretending that losses are secretly gains. It is built by genuinely engaging with the loss, finding the genuine meaning in it, integrating it into the life story as something that was survived and learned from, and allowing the survival itself to be a form of evidence about what is possible. The person who has started over once, genuinely, who has felt the full weight of the closed door, processed the loss honestly, found the genuine meaning in it, and built something real on the other side, is measurably different from the person who has not. Not in resilience score, in the specific knowledge that starting over is survivable, that the world on the other side of the closed door exists and can be inhabited, that the psychological immune system, the rationalization engine, the post-traumatic growth mechanism, all of the remarkable human capacities for beginning again, actually work. That knowledge is not abstract, it is embodied. It is the specific confidence that comes from having done the thing you feared was impossible. And it is, the research suggests, the most powerful resource available for the next closed door. There is a specific concern that this conversation needs to address directly. Because the implicit question behind the title, as long as the closed door is not your coffins, you can start over, carries within it a question that many people are genuinely asking. Does that really hold at any age, at any life stage, after any amount of time has passed? The cultural narrative about starting over has a strong age bias. Reinvention is celebrated in young people. In older adults, it tends to be treated with skepticism or condescension, the implication being that the time for starting over has passed, that the structures of a life are too established to genuinely reorganize, that the capacities required for genuine new beginnings have diminished. The research says something more complicated and considerably more hopeful. Research by Laura Carstensen at Stanford's Center on Longevity, whose socio-emotional selectivity theory is one of the most influential frameworks in the psychology of aging, found that older adults consistently show specific qualities that are actually advantageous for starting over. They show higher emotional regulation capacity than younger adults. They are more selective and more intentional about what they invest in. They are more present tense focused, and they are less likely to pursue goals for reasons of social status or external approval, and more likely to pursue goals that are genuinely aligned with their actual values. These qualities, the research suggests, make older adults in many ways better equipped for genuine starting over than younger adults, not worse. The starting over that is genuinely values grounded, genuinely chosen, genuinely aligned with who one actually is rather than who one is supposed to be. That kind of starting over tends to become more accessible, not less, as the developmental tasks of later life proceed. Research by Carl Pillemer at Cornell University on life wisdom. The study of what older adults have learned through extensive life experience that younger people have not, found that one of the most consistent pieces of wisdom offered by older adults is about the possibility of new beginnings. Across thousands of interviews, Pillemer found that older adults consistently counsel younger people to attempt the things they are afraid to attempt, because the regret of not trying is characteristically more painful than the regret of having tried and failed. The people who have lived longest and who have the most experience with both closed doors and new beginnings are not the ones who are most skeptical about starting over. They are the ones who are most convinced of its possibility, because they have, in many cases, lived through enough closed doors to know from personal experience that the world on the other side is real and inhabitable and sometimes genuinely better. Research by Howard Friedman and Leslie Martin at the University of California, Riverside on the Longevity Project, a decades-long study of the factors that predict both long life and quality of life, found that one of the most consistent predictors of well-being in later life is what they describe as adaptive flexibility, the capacity to adjust to changed circumstances, to revise plans that are not working, and to find genuine engagement with the new circumstances that life produces rather than remaining committed to plans that reality has foreclosed. Adaptive flexibility is, in essence, the capacity for starting over. And the research does not find that this capacity diminishes with age. For people who have exercised it across a lifetime, it tends to strengthen. Let's add the neurological dimension, because the psychological research on starting over is supported by neuroscience that is both more recent and more directly applicable than most people know. Research on neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change its structure and function in response to experience, has fundamentally revised the century-old assumption that the brain structure is fixed after early development. The research of Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, and of Norman Doidge at the University of Toronto, whose book The Brain That Changes Itself synthesized the research for a general audience, established that the adult brain retains the capacity for significant structural and functional change across the entire lifespan. The brain can form new neural connections, strengthen existing ones, and reorganize functional regions in response to learning, experience, and deliberate practice. At 60, at 70, at 80, the specific changes may be slower and require more deliberate effort than changes in younger brains. But they are real, documented, and consequential. Research by Sandrine Touré at King's College London on neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons, found that the adult hippocampus continues to generate new neurons throughout life, and that this neurogenesis is significantly influenced by lifestyle factors including exercise, diet, stress, and cognitive engagement. The adult brain, in other words, is not a fixed structure that is simply declining with age. It is a dynamic system that continues to respond to the challenges and experiences it is given. Research on skill acquisition in adults by K. Anders Ericsson at Florida State University, whose work on deliberate practice is among the most influential in the psychology of expertise, found that adult brains are capable of significant skill development through deliberate, effortful practice across virtually every domain studied. The ceiling on adult learning is considerably higher than most people believe, and the primary limiting factor is not biological capacity, but the belief about biological capacity. The neuroscience of starting over says what the psychology of starting over says. The closed door is not the end of the brain's capacity for new beginnings. The mechanisms required for genuinely starting over, the formation of new patterns, the development of new skills, the construction of new relationships and new meaning, are available to every living brain, regardless of age, as long as the cognitive system is engaged and the person is genuinely committed to the new beginning rather than remaining focused on the closed door. The biology and the psychology point in the same direction. The capacity is there. What determines whether it is used is not age or circumstance. It is the specific combination of psychological tools and genuine commitment that we have been discussing throughout this video. There is a dimension of starting over that the research increasingly recognizes as the most challenging and most consequential. And it is not about skills or resources or support systems. It is about identity. Research by Hermina Ibarra at INSEAD on what she calls working identity, the The specific question of how people change their professional and personal identities through career transitions and life reinventions found that the most significant barrier to genuine starting over is not practical but psychological, the reluctance to experiment with a new identity before the old one has been fully released. Most people, when facing a closed door, want to know who they will be on the other side before they step through. They want a clear picture of the new identity, the new role, the new direction, the new sense of who they are and how they are understood. Before they commit to letting go of the old one, they want the destination to be fully visible before they leave the origin. Ibarra's research found that genuine identity change does not work this way. It is not a linear process in which the old identity is released and the new one is adopted. It is a process of prototyping, of experimenting in small and temporary ways with possible new identities, gradually building evidence about what fits and what does not until the new identity has accumulated enough real experience to sustain genuine commitment. The person who is starting over most effectively is not the person who has perfectly resolved their identity before beginning. It is the person who is willing to act before the identity is clear, who is willing to experiment, to try, to be a beginner again, to be in the uncomfortable in-between of not yet knowing who they are in the new context, long enough for the new identity to develop through the doing. Research by Dan McAdams on narrative identity found that the most psychologically healthy and resilient people are those whose life narratives contain significant episodes of genuine identity change, periods of not knowing, of searching, of beginning again, that are integrated into the story as evidence of the self's capacity for genuine development, rather than experienced as evidence of the self's inadequacy or instability. The closed door disrupts the narrative, and the research on identity and starting over is saying, let it be disrupted. The disruption is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of the next chapter, and the next chapter requires a period of genuine not knowing before the new identity can be genuinely built. This is perhaps the hardest thing the psychology of starting over asks, because the in-between, the period after the closed door and before the new beginning has fully formed, is genuinely uncomfortable. It is the period of ambiguity, of partial commitment, of being neither fully who you were nor fully who you will be. And the temptation to rush through it, to grab the first available identity, the first available direction, the first available substitute for the thing that was lost, is real and strong. The research says, resist it. Stay in the not knowing long enough for the genuine next chapter to begin to clarify. Not indefinitely and not passively, but actively, curiously, experimentally, trying things, gathering evidence, building the beginning of the new before the whole of it is clear. Research by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler at Harvard and UC San Diego on social contagion established something that is directly relevant to the project of starting over. The behaviors, beliefs, and outcomes of the people closest to you influence your own behaviors, beliefs, and outcomes through documented mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious choice. Starting over is significantly harder or easier depending on who is in close proximity while you are doing it. And the research is specific about what kind of social presence is helpful and what kind undermines the process. Research by Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School on creative environments found that the most significant variable in whether people pursue genuinely new and uncertain directions is what she calls psychological safety. The specific sense that it is safe to take risks, to fail, to be a beginner, to not yet know what you're doing without being judged or punished for the attempt. Psychological safety is not the same as social warmth or approval. It is the specific quality of a social environment in which genuine experimentation is possible. Research by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School on psychological safety in organizational settings found that teams with high psychological safety consistently show higher levels of innovation, higher levels of learning from failure, and more genuine engagement with difficult and uncertain tasks. The individual who is starting over in a social context that provides psychological safety, where the beginning stages of the new direction will be met with genuine encouragement, where failure in the early stages is understood as part of the learning rather than as evidence of inadequacy, is significantly more likely to persist through the difficult early stages than the individual doing the same, starting over in a context of skepticism or judgment. Research by Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz on the Harvard study of adult development found that the single most powerful predictor of well-being and resilience in later life is the quality of close relationships, and that this is true not only in general but specifically in the context of adversity and starting over. The people who recover most fully from significant setbacks are the people who have at least one close relationship in which they feel genuinely known and genuinely supported. The practical implication is specific. The quality of your starting over is substantially determined by who is with you while you're doing it. Not in the sense of having a large support network, numbers are not the active ingredient. In the sense of having at least one relationship in which genuine experimentation is safe, in which the difficult early stages of the new beginning will be received with genuine support rather than skepticism or judgment. If that relationship exists in your life, invest in it. If it does not, the research suggests that finding and building it is among the most valuable investments available to the person who is starting over. Let's take the longest possible view, because the individual experiences of starting over, the specific closed doors, the specific new beginnings, are important. But what the research on full human lives tells us about the role of starting over across an entire lifetime is more important still. Research by Dan McAdams on narrative identity and life stories found that the people who report the highest levels of meaning, purpose, and well-being at the end of their lives are not the people whose lives contain the fewest closed doors. They are the people whose narrative of those doors, the story they tell about what happened when the things they were building did not work out, when the directions they were pursuing turned out to be dead ends, contains what McAdams calls redemption sequences, genuine accounts of how the closed door, over time and through genuine engagement, led to something better than what was lost. These people are not pretending. The research distinguishes carefully between genuine post-adversity growth narratives and what McAdams calls contamination sequences, narratives in which positive circumstances are ruined or diminished, which are associated with lower well-being and higher depression. The redemption sequence is not a forced positive reframe. It is the genuinely accurate account from a person who has survived enough closed doors to see the full arc of what actually happened when the doors closed. Research by Carl Pillemer on the wisdom of older adults, whose thousands of interviews produced the book 30 Lessons for Living, found that the most consistent advice offered by people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s about how to live a genuinely good life includes a specific and repeated recommendation. Try the things you are afraid to try. Pursue the directions that feel important even when they are uncertain. Do not let the fear of the closed door prevent you from opening the ones that are currently available. The people who have lived longest and who have experienced the most closed doors are, on average, the most convinced that starting over is both possible and worth it. Not because they have forgotten the pain of the doors that closed, but because they have lived long enough to see what can grow on the other side. Research by Lubomirski on sustainable happiness found that the activities and choices most strongly associated with enduring well-being are not the ones that produce the most intense positive experiences in the moment. They are the ones that involve genuine engagement with something meaningful, genuine effort towards something that matters, genuine connection with people who are real and present, genuine alignment between the life being lived and the values the person actually holds. Starting over, done with genuine commitment and genuine engagement, is one of the most reliable routes to this kind of well-being available. Not because it is easy, because the very difficulty of it, the engagement with genuine challenge, the construction of genuine new meaning, the development of genuine new capacity, is precisely the kind of psychological work that produces the enduring well-being that comfortable stagnation does not. The closed door is not the end, the coffin's door is the end. And between every other closed door and that one, there is a life that is still happening, still capable of genuine new beginnings, still in possession of every remarkable human capacity for reconstruction, growth, and the finding of genuine meaning in the world that exists on the other side. The world is there. The question is only whether you are ready to genuinely look. Here is what I want to leave with you. If there is a door that has recently closed in your life, a plan that did not work out, a direction that turned out to be wrong, a version of your future that will not be, I want to offer you the most honest and most research-grounded thing I can say about it. The pain is real. Feel it completely, without rushing past it or covering it with premature reframing. The loss is real, and it deserves the full weight of genuine acknowledgement. And then, not yet, but when you are ready, and you will know when you are ready, begin the specific work of meaning making. Ask not just what was lost, but what was revealed. Not just what cannot happen now, but what might happen instead. Not just who you were in the direction that just closed, but who you might become in the direction that is now open. The psychological immune system is already working. The rationalization engine is already running. The remarkable human capacity for genuine new beginnings is available to you right now in the specific combination of your particular history, your particular strengths, in the particular world that exists on the other side of the door that just closed. The only question is whether you will give it the specific engagement that allows it to do its work. If the kind of specific research-grounded, honest conversation about what it actually takes to navigate the real difficulties of human life is what you are looking for. This channel is built for exactly that. Every video is the same commitment, the science of how the mind works, and what it means for the life you're actually living. See you in the next one.